Hey, what is up, mortals? It is Robo Celestial here with a new video for you. Welcome to What If Deku Could Use Haki. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. Oh, what was that for? Izuku shouted. After rubbing his head, in front of him stood none other than his master, Rayleigh, and he was not happy. You know why I did it. You used it at almost full power while fighting that Todoroki kid, the silver-haired geezer responded, holding his clenched fist in front of himself. Izuku looked at his master with a look of confusion. He understood that Rayleigh was referring to his conqueror's haki, but the green-haired boy couldn't recall using it during his match with Todoroki. What are you talking about? Izuku asked, visibly confused. Rayleigh looked shocked at first, until he noticed that the green-haired boy wasn't playing dumb. Oh, Izuku exclaimed, as Rayleigh hit him more furiously than before. You moron, you didn't even notice, the silver-haired geezer shouted, angrier than ever before. Izuku had nothing to say against his master, for he was right. The fact that Izuku lost control of his conqueror's haki, even for just a second, was not good. He is basically a bomb, and he needs to be able to control the output of his blast if he doesn't want to cause too much unnecessary damage. Next time you lose control over it, you're getting the club, Rayleigh then said, sounding more ominous than before. Izuku began to shiver at the mere mention of the club, because all he could think of was the pain he suffered during the blindfolded training. The green-haired boy continued to shiver in silence, until Rayleigh hit him again. Oh, what was that for? Izuku shouted, sounding a little frustrated now. Rayleigh just sighed, before his signature goofy smile returned to him. There, now I'm calm, the silver-haired geezer said, and Izuku only felt more annoyed. Rayleigh then proceeded to walk away from his student, after saying, your next opponent is that Ada kid. I think we both know better than to underestimate him. But you won't need to use any conqueror's haki. With a calm voice, Izuku managed to calm down a little, before he responded, I know, you don't need to tell me that. With a calm voice, before he went to prepare for the match. After a proper preparation, both competitors had gathered in the ring. Ada stared at Izuku with burning determination, because he wanted to win. The cavalry battle had left a scar on him, for the green-haired boy seemed to be able to defend against his reciprocal burst, but he was still determined to win. It didn't matter if his opponent could defend. He would just be faster. Izuku was still as calm as ever. He looked unamused, as if he was already bored, but that was just a facade. On the inside, he was preparing himself for anything, using observation to try and figure out what his opponent is thinking and planning. He does have something to his advantage, though. A bluff. Izuku could sense that Ida was making him seem like something he isn't, that he is much stronger than he actually is. The blue-haired boy probably thinks that Izuku was faster than him in the cavalry battle, and the green-haired boy could definitely use this to his advantage. Begin, Midnight shouted, and both competitors sprung into action. Ida began charging immediately, and Izuku stood guard. The blue-haired boy sent a kick towards Izuku's side, but the green-haired boy simply blocked it with an armament-infused hand. Ada then followed with another kick to Izuku's other side, only for it to meet the same result. This exchange continued for a while. Ada kept sending his powerful kicks, and Izuku either blocked or just avoided them. Then Ada suddenly changed his angle, attempting to kick Izuku over the skull. The green-haired boy saw this coming, but was shocked to see what was happening. In the middle of swing, Ada's legs began to emit a blue flame. This almost made Izuku panic, as the blue-haired boy shouted, reciprocal burst, before the kick suddenly turned into a blur, before crashing into Izuku's skull. A loud bang could be heard, and it was followed by the already familiar sound of bones breaking. Everyone looked to the ring in fear, thinking that Ida had accidentally cracked his opponent's skull open, only to be shocked. The force had pushed Izuku down to his knees, but that was all. He then stood back up, as if nothing had happened. He then looked over to Ida, who was in a lot of pain. He was balancing himself on one foot, because the other one was broken. Ada's plan was simple and effective. By throwing kicks at a certain rhythm with a certain speed, he made Izuku notice a form of pattern and fall into tunnel vision. That way he could make sure that the green-haired boy wouldn't be able to avoid the reciprocal kick, for it was activated at an unexpected time. It was a good plan, but there was one factor that would make its downfall. That factor being none other than the bluff. It was because of the bluff that Ida had to make such a hasty plan, and it made him miss one very important detail. He forgot that his own teammate, Todoroki, had tried to do something similar to what he just did. He tried to make direct contact with Izuku's body at high speeds, only to break himself while trying. The audience was shocked, But among them was someone that didn't share that feeling. It was Rayleigh. And he didn't know what to think of this. He was a little shocked. But that was only because of the fact that Ida had been dumb enough to attempt something like that. Wow, what an idiot, Rayleigh boldly said. As he pinched the bridge of his nose, Izuku looked at Ida in genuine shock. As he spoke, "Did you seriously try to kick me over the skull?" the green-haired boy asked. But he wouldn't get a response from his opponent. Izuku just got more annoyed. As he said, "You idiot," before charging at Ida. The blue-haired boy didn't have enough time to move before he received a powerful kick to the template. The kick didn't have any haki in it, but it was still enough to knock Ida unconscious. "That is how you kick someone," Izuku then said. As Ida's unconscious body hit the ground, Ida is unable to continue. Midoriya advances to the final round, Midnight then announced. Before the audience began to roar and bellow, Rayleigh looked at his student with the same confliction as before. Before All Might asked, "Did young Midoriya use haki to block that kick to the head?" In slight confusion, because he was unable to tell what was happening, Rayleigh just sounded a little tired. As he answered, "No, his skull is just really sturdy. Turns out that bones get stronger after taking some sort of punishment over a long period of time." This revelation made All Might confused, until he realized something. Rayleigh wasn't afraid to hit Izuku with an excessive amount of force. Even when it served no practical purpose, could Izuku's skull have become super sturdy thanks to all that abuse? The blonde hero looked towards the silver-haired geezer for some form of confirmation on that last thought. But he saw something else. He saw that Rayleigh was suddenly giggling while loosely swinging his fist in the air. This was enough for a confirmation, but it also served to scare the blonde. He was afraid of both Rayleigh's abuse and Izuku's well-being. The time had finally come. The match that would decide everything. The final round was here. And it was between Katsuki Bakugo and Izuku Midoriya. Katsuki was trying everything to make himself fully prepared. But nothing seemed to be working. He tried to be angry when thinking about Deku. But his mind was filled with something else instead. He didn't see a weak and annoying weakling. Instead, he saw something unearthly that reeked of death. The blonde couldn't shake this, for he didn't know what it was. He felt his spirit trembling whenever he thought of Deku. And he just couldn't stop it. Why was this happening? What is this feeling? Those are questions he asked himself, but denied the answer. He knew what this was deep down, but he refused to admit it. He refused to admit that it was fear. And that Deku was the source of it. Katsuki tried to shake these thoughts out of his head before walking his way down to the ring. Upon arriving, he noticed that Izuku was already there, patiently waiting for him. He looked calm, unamused, and almost passive-aggressive. He looked as if he was ready to unleash hell. And it didn't help to cure Katsuki's fear. "Begin," Midnight shouted, and so it began. The first one to act was Izuku, who opened by charging and throwing a punch to Katsuki's stomach. The blonde didn't have enough time to react, and took it full force. Katsuki then tried to counter, but it would amount to nothing. His explosion connected with nothing. As he received another heavy blow to the head, Katsuki staggered backwards. As his vision started to get blurry, he could barely balance himself, and the world seemed to twist and turn into a nightmarish whirlpool. The blonde then began to shiver, while rubbing his arms as if he was freezing. An expression of pure terror was deeply plastered onto his face. As his body hunched over and cowered, what he saw could only be explained as a demon from the darkest pits of hell. He saw Izuku, but there was no way that he was human. The green-haired boy wore his usual calm expression, while his shadow stood up and took an odd shape behind him. The shadow didn't reflect his silhouette like it usually did. Instead, it took the shape of various monsters that Katsuki has seen before. In it, he could see a shadow of the sludge villain, along with the silhouette of the Namu from the USJ. On top of that, he could see the shadow of Rayleigh, along even All Might. Katsuki saw all of these shadows behind Izuku, as if he was a much greater threat than all of them. The blonde trembled more violently than before, until Izuku moved again. The green-haired boy had dashed and hit Katsuki in the gut once more, before throwing him into the ground. The blonde was lying on his back, still cowering in fear. The green-haired boy towered over him with a menacing glare. Before he reeled his fist back, Katsuki closed his eyes and waited, for he didn't want to look at this anymore. He waited, and he could almost feel the fist approaching him at rapid speeds, until something happened. Katsuki opened his eyes once more, and was shocked to see that Izuku's fist had stopped just centimeters over his face. The world around him seemed normal once again. As he heard the green-haired boy speak, "What the hell happened to you, Kaken?" Izuku said, sounding a little angry. Katsuki looked at the green-haired boy, only to see that his expression was a weird mixture between anger and concern. Why are you terrified all of a sudden? What do you have to be afraid of? Izuku then shouted. Katsuki still didn't respond, and Izuku just got more annoyed. You challenged me, Kaken. You wanted to face me. I wanted to face you too. But I have no interest in fighting a man who is afraid of his own shadow, the green-haired boy said, before he took a few steps away from Katsuki. The blonde sat himself up as he looked at Izuku. You have 10 seconds to get back up. 10 seconds. Before I walk out of this ring and forfeit the match, the green-haired boy said, before proceeding to slowly walk towards the edge of the ring. Katsuki's fear was quickly drowned out by bewilderment. He was going to forfeit, just like that. One part of Katsuki felt relieved, but another felt angry. He was angry over the fact that Izuku would even say something like that. That he had the balls to do so. More importantly, he hated the idea of letting Izuku win. Katsuki's expression quickly turned into one of rage. As he stood up and fired an explosion, the blast was aimed right next to Izuku, missing him by a hair. The green-haired boy didn't even flinch. As he stopped and slowly turned back to Katsuki. Get your ass back here and fight, Deku, Katsuki shouted. Sounding as angry as he usually did, the green-haired boy smiled ever so slightly after hearing this. As he said, there you are. I was waiting for you to arrive. Now we can actually fight. Katsuki heard this comment by Izuku and grinned as he said, let's do this, Deku, before taking a stance. Izuku also grinned as he responded with, hell yeah, Kaken, before taking a stance of his own. Rayleigh smiled upon witnessing this. While it was dumb to help your opponent win in a battle, he still liked what he was seeing. What he saw showed that both fighters cared, and that they refused to give up on each other. Izuku gave Katsuki a chance to be his rival, and the blonde didn't hesitate to grab that chance. Finally, now they can fight for real, the silver-haired geezer said. As he continued to watch the match, the fighters charged at each other, both adamant to win. Izuku had covered both arms and legs with Haki, while Katsuki used his explosions. Eventually they clashed. And one thing was made clear immediately. Izuku had the advantage in strength, speed, and many other categories. This fact made the audience immediately believe that Katsuki had no hope of winning. The duel raged on with intensity. Izuku held the upper hand at the beginning, but slowly it became noticeable that they were equal. Then the almost impossible happened. Katsuki began to control the fight as if he was the superior one. Now the spectators didn't know what was happening. Even the number one hero himself was confused. I don't get it. Young Midoriya is clearly superior in almost every field. So why is he being pushed back? The blonde hero asked, letting his confusion be known. Rayleigh stood next to him and continued to smile. As he answered, you can't tell. It's because of that Bakugo kid. He's a genius. All Might was even more confused, as he prompted Rayleigh to explain. He's learned since his last fight with Izuku, and he knows better than to challenge his opponent at their own game. The silver-haired geezer then explained. All Might was still confused, until he took a closer look at the battle. Katsuki wasn't throwing his attacks at random. It was clear that every single one of them was carefully planned and calculated. Then it hit him. Katsuki was indeed a genius. The blonde knew that he couldn't hope to match Izuku. He was clearly outmatched in every field. But this didn't mean that he couldn't win. He would just have to be smart and respond to Izuku's attacks with their natural counter. By doing it this way, he could negate the gap between them, and he could take control of the battle. Rayleigh's smile grew wider as the battle went on. He was smiling over the fact that his student had found someone he could let loose with, someone that could properly rival him. Katsuki continued his assault over Izuku, growing more violent as time passed. The green-haired boy was backed into a corner, and nothing he did seemed to be working. The blonde then sent an explosion into Izuku's stomach, making him stagger and fall to his knees. Katsuki didn't let this opportunity slip. As he decided to finish it, the blonde used his explosions to spin himself at high speeds, until he shouted, howitzer impact, before firing what was arguably the biggest explosion he's ever made. The entire stadium shook from the impact, as the massive fireball engulfed the green-haired boy entirely. The audience, mainly Class 1 and All Might, were horrified. They thought that Izuku had been seriously hurt, or even killed for that matter. Their worries stopped, however, when a powerful wave was sent out in all directions. It was similar to the one that appeared during the second round, except this one was far more powerful. The entire stadium shook under the pressure that it created, and almost half the audience fell unconscious. Not even Midnight, Cementos, and Present Mic could fight against this incredible force. Katsuki recognized this power, for he had felt it before. It was exactly the same as the thing he had experienced when he was 4 years old. Except now it was way stronger. The blonde couldn't fight it for much longer either. As he too fell unconscious, then the wave suddenly vanished. And everything seemed to be back to normal. The audience was stunned to silence. No one dared to even utter a sound. Then they could see something stand up in a cloud of smoke. Upon closer inspection they saw that it was Izuku. And he was still conscious. "All right, that was bizarre," Aizawa then said through the speaker. After taking the mic, the tired teacher almost sounded shell-shocked. As he then proceeded to say, "Midnight is unconscious. But I think it goes without saying that Izuku Midoriya won the match." The audience was still silent after hearing this. But they quickly picked up the pace and began to cheer for the winner of the sports festival. Izuku looked for Katsuki until he found him unconscious on the floor. The green-haired boy walked up to the blonde. Before he picked him up, Izuku then proceeded to carry Katsuki out of the ring, making the audience cheer even more because of the sportsmanship. Rayleigh was still awake during all of this, but he wasn't cheering. He was silent and completely still. He didn't say a word, but one could still tell that he was angry if not furious. The silver-haired geezer then left the stands, as if he was off looking for something. After everyone regained consciousness and was informed of the match results, the award ceremony began. Ada had to leave due to family issues, so Takoyami was alone on the third-place pedestal with a bronze medal. Bakugo was standing on the second-place pedestal passive-aggressive, as All Might gave him his silver medal. Then he walked up to Izuku and gave him his golden medal. The stadium cheered and bellowed, congratulating the many contestants. After the ceremony, Izuku was swarmed by his classmates. They all congratulated him, while also asking how he managed to do certain things and if he actually was quirkless. The green-haired boy started to get annoyed by the constant question about him having a quirk, but he didn't get to voice that annoyance when Todoroki spoke up. "Hey, Midoriya," he said, his voice being as cold as always. Izuku looked at him, a little confused, before the bi-colored teen continued. "Well done," he said, as he smiled and raised his hand for a fist bump. Izuku smiled back at the ice user, as he said, "Thanks, brain freeze," before giving Todoroki a fist bump. "Hey, Deku," an angry voice, recognized as Katsuki, then shouted. Izuku turned towards him and was surprised by what happened next. The blonde also held his hand out for a fist bump, as he said, "You did well, but I'll be taking that medal from you next time," with his usual voice. Izuku was shocked to hear this, but he gave Katsuki a smile and said, "Thanks, and I'd love to see you try," before fist bumping him as well. The class then returned to their gleeful conversing, quickly returning to the topic of Izuku having a quirk. This was stopped, however, when an old voice shouted, "Hey, Izuku," quite angrily. Izuku recognized this voice, and he began to tremble because he knew what it meant. The class turned to the source of the voice, only to find an angry Rayleigh swinging a massive club in one of his hands. "Remember what I said before your match with that Ada kid," the silver-haired geezer then said, as he waved the massive club around playfully. Izuku already knew what was coming, so he smiled awkwardly while putting his hands up and saying, "Hey, let's talk about this," with a trembling voice. Rayleigh just looked more annoyed, as he said, "I'm done using my words with you. It's clear that they don't get through that thick skull of yours. I'll have to beat it into you," with a furious tone, before charging towards Izuku. The green-haired boy panicked, as he screamed and ran away. "Please, have mercy," he shouted, but his master only answered with a cold, "You know better than to beg me for mercy." Class wanna watch this entire scene play out until they all burst out laughing. They laughed so hard that they had tears in their eyes. Even Todoroki and Katsuki did so. Somewhere they knew that this was actually cruel, and that they shouldn't be laughing, but they just couldn't help themselves. Izuku, arguably one of the strongest students in their class, who rarely shows his emotions, was running in fear. He was actually running away with his tail between his legs, because he was terrified of what his master might do to him. The class continued to laugh uncontrollably, even when the master and student were long gone. They all continued to laugh together. Head boy walked up to the blonde. Before he picked him up, Izuku then proceeded to carry Katsuki out of the ring, making the audience cheer even more because of the sportsmanship. Rayleigh was still awake during all of this, but he wasn't cheering. He was silent and completely still. He didn't say a word, but one could still tell that he was angry if not furious. The silver-haired geezer then left the stands, as if he was off looking for something. After everyone regained consciousness and was informed of the match results, the award ceremony began. Ada had to leave due to family issues, so Takoyami was alone on the third-place pedestal with a bronze medal. Bakugo was standing on the second place pedestal passive-aggressive. As All Might gave him his silver medal, then he walked up to Izuku and gave him his golden medal. The stadium cheered and bellowed, congratulating the many contestants. After the ceremony, Izuku was swarmed by his classmates. They all congratulated him, while also asking how he managed to do certain things and if he actually was quirkless. The green-haired boy started to get annoyed by the constant question about him having a quirk. But he didn't get to voice that annoyance when Todoroki spoke up. "Hey, Midoriya," he said, his voice being as cold as always. Izuku looked at him, a little confused, before the bi-colored teen continued. "Well done," he said, as he smiled and raised his hand for a fist bump. Izuku smiled back at the ice user as he said, "Thanks, brain freeze," before giving Todoroki a fist bump. "Hey, Deku," an angry voice, recognized as Katsuki, then shouted. Izuku turned towards him and was surprised by what happened next. The blonde also held his hand out for a fist bump as he said, "You did well, but I'll be taking that medal from you next time," with his usual voice. Izuku was shocked to hear this, but he gave Katsuki a smile and said, "Thanks, and I'd love to see you try," before fist bumping him as well. The class then returned to their gleeful conversing, quickly returning to the topic of Izuku having a quirk. This was stopped, however, when an old voice shouted, "Hey, Izuku," quite angrily. Izuku recognized this voice, and he began to tremble because he knew what it meant. The class turned to the source of the voice, only to find an angry Rayleigh swinging a massive club in one of his hands. "Remember what I said before your match with that Ada kid," the silver-haired geezer then said, as he waved the massive club around playfully. Izuku already knew what was coming, so he smiled awkwardly while putting his hands up and saying, "Hey, let's talk about this," with a trembling voice. Rayleigh just looked more annoyed as he said, "I'm done using my words with you. It's clear that they don't get through that thick skull of yours. I'll have to beat it into you," with a furious tone, before charging towards Izuku. The green-haired boy panicked as he screamed and ran away. "Please, have mercy," he shouted, but his master only answered with a cold, "You know better than to beg me for mercy." Class 1 watched this entire scene play out until they all burst out laughing. They laughed so hard that they had tears in their eyes. Even Todoroki and Katsuki did so. Somewhere they knew that this was actually cruel, and that they shouldn't be laughing, but they just couldn't help themselves. Izuku, arguably one of the strongest students in their class, who rarely shows his emotions, was running in fear. He was actually running away with his tail between his legs, because he was terrified of what his master might do to him. The class continued to laugh uncontrollably, even when the master and student were long gone. They all continued to laugh together.